Hi, I'm Lo, a professor and an HDR supervisor in the Faculty of Law of Bond University. Have you ever thought of pursuing HDR study? If your answer is yes, this video is for you. In this video, I will ask professors who are experienced HDR supervisors and students who are doing their doctoral studies to share with you their thoughts and experiences about the pursuit of HDR study. Although each HDR student has his or her own research project, all HDR students face a set of common issues. These issues include how to work with your academic supervisors, how to manage time during HDR study, whether or not to adjust the original research, whether it's important to produce publications and how to do it, what can be done to build a professional network, and how to balance life and work. In addition, prospective HDR students would like to know what they can do to prepare in advance. So what follows are the responses to these questions by professors and students whom I have interviewed.
Yes, you are right. The relationship that a student has with their supervisor is of paramount importance. I think that there are a couple of different sets of factors to take into account. First of all, the supervisor will be busy on many occasions, so the onus is on the student to be proactive in terms of sometimes chasing the supervisor up, but also responsibility for producing their own work. So it doesn't really follow that the supervisor should be following up with the student all the time, trying to chase the student to get work from them. So yes, the supervisor has their role, but the student more importantly has a more important role. So yes, it is a very important relationship. It's probably the most important relationship that you will have during the period in which you are engaged in the higher degree research. Basically, you have to trust your supervisor and your supervisor's views and opinions. Those opinions won't always be the same as yours, but you have to trust them because of the expertise that they have built up over a long period of time. Having said that, respect goes both ways, and the supervisor has to listen to you as well. If there is a particular point that you don't want to concede.
It's really essential that you maintain and manage your relationship with your PhD supervisor throughout the PhD. It's one of the most important people that will be in your life throughout the PhD. It's important to maintain constant communication. We're lucky these days that we have a lot of technological advantages to make sure even if you're overseas, you can meet with your supervisor once a week. It's also really important that you raise any concerns with your supervisor when any issue arises. It's really important to stick to deadlines, both for your supervisor and yourself. And it's important that you nurture the relationship as well with your supervisor. Don't neglect them. They're your biggest helper.
I think the relationship between the student and the supervisor is enormously important, and that the decision that the student makes about who their supervisor is going to be is one that they should take very seriously. I think the supervisor or the supervisors play two really important roles. One is the discipline expert. The student wants to identify someone who is, a real leader in the particular sort of area of research that they want to engage in. But they also want a supervisor who understands the process of completing a PhD, and particularly who understands the sort of the system at that institution, and someone who understands that a student needs to be guided and supported through the process of writing a thesis. So in an ideal world, the student will find a supervisor who's both of those things at the same time. You know, they're a discipline expert and they're somebody who's going to help and support the student. In the real world, that isn't always going to be possible. So that's where the role of the associate supervisor becomes particularly important. And then for me, it doesn't really matter so much which supervisor plays which role. So sometimes your primary supervisor will be the discipline expert, and the associate supervisor will be the person that sort of guides and supports the student. But it works just as well the other way around. As long as both areas are covered, I think either arrangement is fine.
I don't think there are any general rules about any of this. I think every case of a higher research degree is an individual matter, and it depends on the personalities and temperament of the student and the supervisor and the nature, character of the work. And it also, to some extent, depends on the experience of the student. But I think there are some general things that one can say. I think, like any relationship, the basis of it is trust and honesty. And so, therefore, if the supervisor has problems, then as a supervisor, I would raise those directly with the student, in most cases as tactfully as I could. And if a student is having difficulties, then I would expect them to bring those to the knowledge of the supervisor so that we can work around problems. Because with a long-term relationship like this, there'll be good times and there'll be bad times. And I think it's remarkable how flexible the rules can be if they're confronted with some sort of difficulty. But I think that it is important to start the way you mean to go on. So if you, as a student, find that you have a real problem with the supervisor almost immediately, then I think you should deal with it almost immediately and not let it get to a crisis. And I would be the same with the student. I mean, if I felt the student wasn't really serious, wasn't doing the work, wasn't listening, then I think I would think, life is not so long that I can put up with this. So those would be my watchwords: trust, honesty, and timely intervention if you have some problems.
Well, I think the hardest thing is to get the right kind of supervisor, and often as a candidate you don't have an awful lot of choice. But the supervisor is very important, either for expertise in the area or as a good supervisor. Some people are good supervisors without necessarily being experts in the area that the student is in. But the relationship between student and supervisor is very important.
For me, it's an easy question. It's kind of like because I've got a pretty, actually a very good supervisor for my PhD study, and I actually meet him very frequently. Like in the first year, I met him like twice a month. It's very frequently, and it's also easy for me to communicate with him because we had a similar, actually, I'd say, educational background with regard to law. We both started from the civil law system, and then we are now in the common law system. It's kind of easy for us to communicate with each other. I think it's pretty good thing.
Well, I think it's extremely important to manage your time. I just wish after 54 years as an academic lawyer, I had actually learned how to do that, so that I hope that at least one can start to make an honest effort at it. I think that a couple of things are really vital. One is to have realistic deadlines. There's no point in somehow or other by setting an improbable thing, it's going to happen. And then you just get into a cycle of, excuse me, I couldn't do this, I failed, I'm no good, and that doesn't work. I think that applies to both the student and the supervisor. I get more upset actually about supervisors not managing their time well than students. I mean, I think supervisors who sit on students' work for, I think, an unreasonably long time shouldn't be doing that job at all. So therefore, again, like every other thing, it's something you need to talk about. How often you meet, when you set times for doing things. The only absolutely inflexible rule that I have in relation to time is that a student should always give me work that they want me to work through several days before that has to happen. There's no point in arriving with it and expecting me to do, you know, a searching analysis as I go through. So it needs to be a staggered timetable, which gives that sort of time. And I think that perhaps initially it's a good idea to agree on periodic meetings and expect that a few days before student hands in work, meet to discuss it, and then maybe very often I find a student wants to come back within 24 hours because they've gone away, thought about something, and they want to come back and clarify it or challenge it or something like that. So I think of these meetings as being sort of triple whammies. You get the stuff in, we talk about it, and then sometimes you want to come back and talk about it. The other perhaps point about time is that I've always said that students can come and see me whenever they feel the need, even if we do have a formal program of appointments.
Yeah, I think time management on the part of the student is enormously important because, you know, unlike being pretty much any other type of student, the PhD student is given an enormous amount of autonomy and freedom as to how they're going to structure their course of learning. And if the student doesn't have the self-discipline to actually work out for themselves a set of sort of manageable targets and goals, then it can almost become overwhelming when the student thinks, oh, I've got to write 80 to 100,000 words over the next 3 to 4 years. I don't know where to start. I've got all that time. I can put it off for a few months, or I've got to try and get everything done all at once. Whereas if the student is able to, with the assistance of the supervisor, break that down into a series of manageable projects, set some deadlines for those projects and work to those deadlines. And then even when working on one particular project, break that down to a set of manageable weekly targets or even daily targets, or when the enthusiasm and motivation are a bit low, hourly targets. I just need to write a couple of 100 words by 4 o'clock and then I can take a break. If a student is conscious of the importance of doing that, then they'll be fine. They'll always be moving forward. But when they lose sight of that, there's the danger that the student will fall into the trap of constantly procrastinating and postponing, and then there's the despair of realizing that it's been weeks since you last wrote a few words, and it's very easy to avoid all that with some manageable targets.
I think this is very important for PhD study, because altogether you get for your PhD study 3 to 4 years. If you do a bit quicker, and you might be able to finish it within 3 years, but I personally would say 4 years would be an appropriate time for a PhD thesis altogether, and you get to be very careful with the beginning, because I think my personal experience that the first 6 months as I started my PhD journey here at Bonn University is kind of like I was a bit lost for the first 6 months, and sometime during that time you don't know exactly what to read, and it would be more helpful if we could have like a time management course or training in the very beginning. That would be helpful, I think so.
How would I advise them? It's a matter of personality, character to start off with. I mean, some people are naturally good at managing their times, other people are appalling. In the latter category are some people who are very bright, including many academics. And I was once told by a professor of German when I was a young academic that it was the only job where you had to kick yourself up the pants every day. So I would advise students to learn to kick themselves up their pants every day. You have to plan, and you have to have a routine, and you have to ultimately determine those things yourself.
Time management in the PhD is absolutely essential to success, and throughout your academic career as well. It's really important that you stay motivated by deadlines. If you're someone who's extrinsically motivated, it's important to tell people, maybe your friends and family, about your deadlines and stick to them and stay honest with them. If you're more intrinsically motivated, perhaps you can reward yourself when it comes to time management. Try and get, say, 1,000 words a day done. And once you've completed that task, you're allowed to go out for coffee with a friend, or you're allowed to go to the gym.
Yes, time management has been something that I have personally struggled with. I think you need to identify very early on whether you should be engaged in full-time or part-time study. If the expectation is that you cannot devote all of your time to your research, then you should seriously think about going part-time. I was a full-time student engaged in casual teaching work as well as some publishing very early on, and you know, the pressure builds up, especially in the lead up to confirmation, which you really need to do well and excel in to justify your project. So managing time is very important. Yes, so again, I think the supervisor has a role there to play, that they regularly keep in contact, just an email to say, you know, are you going okay? You know, is there anything that I can personally do, without really going too far.
For me, it's actually like very natural, because I had an experience to do research firstly in China and then in Germany before I came here in 2012. And therefore, I've had some experience with regard to adjust your research strategy while you are writing or you are reading. It's kind of like not a big issue for me to adjust myself to my progress always. And then sometimes you also encounter different difficulties while reading or while you are writing, and then you need to modify a bit your strategy and your reading, and sometimes even parts of your thesis structure to make them make the whole thesis a coherent one. I think it hasn't been a big problem for me here for my PhD study.
Yes, I think it's very important to continuously adjust your research, particularly in the first stage of your PhD in your research. As you're learning about the topic, particularly through your literature review, you'll find that more and more interesting topics come to fruition. And it's important that you pick essential topics to your area. However, don't stray too far, but it's a great system to maintain a very strong, close alignment to your topic, whilst also keeping interesting research. So what I tend to do is I have two piles of research on the go always. One that's strict to my research questions, and one on topics that are not closely related, but I find very interesting. So I always have those on the back burner as well to expand my research topic.
Well, I think if you've got a research project at the very beginning, it's probably not worth doing, because inevitably what happens is, as you move into the research takes on its own character and personality, and you might find you close off some lines, you might find you bring in some lines, so it will always be changing and adjusting. So if somebody arrives and says, here we are, here's my complete outline, this is all the stuff I want to do, I always say to them, oh, this is really interesting. Let's pick a spot to start. Keep this as an historic document. And when we've finished it, go back and read it. And then you'll realise just how much you've learned in the process of doing this degree. So I think that flexibility is absolutely essential. Otherwise, it's a waste of everyone's time.
Yes, flexibility is crucial. You cannot be rigid in your approach. You have to realise that your research can change. You mentioned the example of having written a chapter. Now, you might have written a chapter in preparation for confirmation, for instance, and the confirmation panel is not displeased, but they maybe hold a few concerns. Now, luckily, I didn't fall into that category, although I am aware of a couple of students at a different university who had issues with their confirmation. They needed to very quickly realise that the confirmation panel and their supervisors, through the feedback that they're given, are acting in their best interests, in the best interests of the student. So they need to take advice on board. Now, with respect to the student, which I think is more commonplace, you will write a part of a chapter or you will prepare a whole chapter, and you will realise the law has changed, the government policy may have changed, or societal norms, or basically society has progressed beyond what your chapter covers. So I think that the student needs to be flexible, and what I will need to do, as I have basically written my previous chapter and also in the lead up to the next chapter, is take into account that you can have these disconnected isolates or these outliers, not just an interwoven connected series of individuals. So that is something that needs to be taken into account. So yes, flexibility is very important, and the student needs to remain mindful that unless they can produce their thesis very quickly, the changes may need to be taken into account.
Well, it's very, very hard, but to change your mind, or to have your mind changed, is really a creative thing. I think it's an important thing to get the right kind of topic, and you might find after some initial research that it isn't doable, that it isn't viable as a research topic. Not enough to do, say, a doctoral thesis on. So you have to be flexible and you have to adjust. And if a thing is not working, then you change it.
I think it's very important that a student recognize and accept from the very beginning that the scope of their research will be changing. And in fact, it's possible that the focus and the topic of their research might shift the more they learn about their particular area of research. This seems to happen with pretty much every PhD student I've ever met, which is, you start your PhD with a pretty good idea of what you'd like to write about. And the more you learn about that area of research, and the longer you're working on the thesis, you realize, well, that's irrelevant and that's been done, and I'm going to focus on this, and gradually your focus gets narrower and narrower until you end up with something that's actually manageable and relevant and insightful and is a legitimate contribution to human knowledge, which is what you want from a thesis. And if a student starts the PhD process wedded to their particular topic and that scope, then they're going to end up being frustrated because it's going to change. It's inevitable. If they can accept that, they'll be fine. They need to be flexible.
Well, the old rule was that you didn't, and there were pretty cast iron rules that said that you shouldn't, whereas fashions have changed, and we tend to publish things as we go along in research. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. But I mean, conversely, some people really knock together a number of papers and call it a thesis. So that kind of thing is happening as well. If you're going to publish, it's as well to take advice. and to submit to the most appropriate journals. And for that you have to know the background of the journal and their house rules, which are very important because they can knock you back for technicalities. Also, you mustn't get depressed if you're rejected, because most people face that. And they also face dealing with sometimes stupid comments on papers submitted.
It's very important. I think nowadays, as we always say, publish or perish. It's because in academia, this is for now, especially for junior researchers, this is a big thing to think about, because without publication, even you have got your PhD title, and I think it will also be easy for, or it would be difficult for you to find an appropriate place to go. And secondly, I think working on some like journal articles will also help your writing of your thesis, because it's kind of like journal articles is, as I say, is shorter, and you can start with writing these small pieces so that you can gain right experience. Especially for me as an international student, English is not my mother tongue, and sometimes we just say, grammatically, you think there is no problem, but with regard to the language itself, you are encounter problem. If you just write your own thesis and then submit it by the end of your PhD study, you might find a big problem. You might get a very critical like feedback from the reviewers, and you might be required to rewrite them. But if you've got some experience by like publishing the journal articles before you submit your thesis, it's kind of usually, I mean journal articles mean peer-reviewed ones. You've had some experience from these journal article peer reviewers, and it will help you a lot also to write your PhD thesis, I think so.
I think that whether or not a student should be engaging in the publication of their research while they're working on the thesis will vary from student to student and from thesis to thesis. If a student happens to be an academic, particularly if they're a full-time academic at the time, then yes, they're going to be under pressure from their institution to publish as they go, and so they probably need to find a way to do it. But the reality is that some projects need to be completed entirely before the student should go out to the world and say, this is what I've done. Whereas other projects can be broken down into chunks of research that the student could complete and then realize, well, this is ready to be published. Even though I haven't finished the wider thesis, even though I'm still working on my thesis, this part is done and I can publish it. For me, when I was writing my thesis, I didn't publish anything from the thesis while I was writing it, because I had to finish the whole project before I could actually say confidently what I wanted to say. But as soon as I did finish, I published 7 journal articles straight out of the thesis, because they were all banked up and ready to go. For me, I think it's more important that a PhD student try and present their work in progress at conferences and at seminars. There, it's an opportunity for them to get feedback on the work without necessarily committing to putting something into the form of publication, which they may not be ready to do.
Publications are important. I think we need to distinguish between sort of the traditional approach and the modern approach. And the modern approach is more so publish or perish, which I think has infiltrated the HDR student psyche, which is a shame, because I think very early on, and also in the lead up to submission, I think it's important that the student focuses on building a solid basis of research and understanding, and then theoretically the journal articles and the books, the publications will follow. In more recent years though, and I've fallen into this category again myself, where I've been sort of concerned with stagnation. So I had looked for publishing opportunities, and I think that that was a mistake. And some very good advice that my primary supervisor gave me was, be concerned with your research. I have every faith that you will be a very good academic and a very good commentator. However, at the moment, we need to look at getting the PhD completed as soon as possible, and then through your PhD work you can produce 3 or 4 journal articles or perhaps a book. So all of that will come, but at the moment you should be concerned about your work. Having said that, where you have consulted with your supervisor and where your supervisor believes that a project may be in your best interests, say a project that the supervisor is running himself or herself, then they might bring you on board and give you a small role in the proceedings and invite you to prepare a submission or a journal article. In those circumstances, when your supervisor is acutely aware and gives his or her approval, then I think it's warranted. But again, I stress, publication should be sort of addressed with some degree of caution.
Well, I think in today's world, it probably is necessary to produce publications because, you know, if you're doing a higher research degree, which is going to take years, you need to be able to demonstrate to the world and to yourself that you can produce work of publishable quality along the way. I would hope that most people who are tackling this kind of degree will have already done something which meets that standard. So sometimes they will come in with a paper or something which they've done earlier, and so quite independently of the degree, we can work on that to turn that into a publishable piece. Then there may be a chapter, there may be a point, there may be something which we're going to abandon from the thesis, but which might be worth doing something on. So I think it's a good thing to have some mileposts along the way. So you can say, well, I did this and this and this. And also, I think if people have not had a lot of experience in writing before and writing at some length, it's a good place to learn, because you don't have to expect to publish your first piece in an A-star journal, you know, so you can gradually work up to the kind of quality that you need to have. I remember now looking back at the first thing I ever published. When I went back and read it 2 years later, I wanted to crawl under my desk and cut my throat. And I went and talked to a colleague, and he said, just shows that you've made progress. And I think you really have to take that kind of attitude to this sort of work as you're going on.
It's absolutely essential to make sure you have a strong research profile throughout your thesis writing. It's a trap to not be able to focus on other publications and conferences and reports, but it's really essential you prioritize them. And any good supervisor will tell you it's very, very important to start your academic career, start networking, attending conferences, writing reviews for papers and your own papers so that you can get a citation profile before you become employed after the PhD.
I think PhD students should use every opportunity available to talk about their thesis with other people, particularly with people who are leaders and experts in their particular field of research. So no, the students should not limit themselves to getting feedback from and being mentored by their PhD supervisor. They should be out there going to conferences, even if they're not presenting at the conference, going to conferences in their area, meeting as many academics as possible, talking about their research, because you know the one thing that they have to ensure that they do when they write a thesis is that it is presenting a line of reasoning and a conclusion that has academic merit and credibility, and that isn't going to be immediately torn to pieces as soon as the student tries to publish work from their thesis. And the best way to make sure that's not going to happen and to find out what other academics are thinking about in that area is to talk to those academics as often as they can.
Yes, it's extremely important to build a professional network, starting within your own faculty. It's important that you come onto campus, attend regular professional networking courses and conferences within your faculty. But throughout your PhD, you'll have opportunities to go overseas as well and to expand your international network. And the first place to start is with your supervisor. Ask them to introduce you to some of their colleagues, search the internet for some really influential authors on your topic and track them down, send them an email, see where they'll be and if they're ever going to be visiting your institution. And if so, you can network with them.
Well, networks are popular. I think that one way in which you build up a network is to attend conferences, try and give a paper at a conference, socialise at a conference, enter an appearance, to use a legal phrase. And emails is the great form of communication now, and it's possible to write informally to people. You don't necessarily get a reply from busy people, but people they can often communicate with you pretty informally via email. That itself has its dangers, and you have to be very careful about what you say in an email in case you are being silly or defamatory. Yeah, I think it's always possible just by being sociable. But you have to be careful because people have got egos, and if your supervisor finds that you're really talking to somebody else who has different ideas from them, you might get yourself confused, you might get yourself into a complicated interpersonal situation. Some people are natural mentors, some people are not natural mentors. And it may be that your supervisor is not a natural mentor. I think you've got to be a bit careful about this because of petty jealousies. I don't think it's as bad in Australia as it would be in Germany, for example, where the professors have got often a rather inflated view of their position vis-a-vis students.
Well, it depends on what you're doing. It may be that you're working in an area where there is a big contribution to be made both by you and by whatever profession is relevant to the particular area where you are. On the other hand, you may have a, quote, pure piece of research that actually has very little immediate connection with the profession. But I don't think, as some people do, some people kind of look down on professional connections and think of them as being, you know, something like a rather dubious trade link, which is detracting from the quality of their work. But I've always found it's very useful to talk to somebody who's actually doing the job and say, well, how would you do that? Or what do you think about that? Or am I totally off the planet when I'm talking about this kind of thing? How do you build them up? I think what you begin to find is that there are lots and lots of meeting places where all kinds of people will come together to talk about a topic of interest. And it helps if you get involved in that. It helps if you get involved in going to things like that. And initially, what is really important that you learn to work the room, you go around, you talk to everybody you can, and then very soon you'll find you'll be asked maybe to do a small contribution. Once you do that, the whole thing will steamroll from there. So you have to go out and get it. It's not suddenly going to wrap itself up and deposit itself in your lap. But you have to be very careful about this, as you have to be about every opinion you look at, because some of them are totally unsupported by any evidence. They're just, you know, the product of professional prejudice. They're interesting, but they may be dangerous.
More generally, I think in terms of establishing a network, in terms of contacts, yes, conferences, symposiums, colloquiums, they are very good in that regard, and yes, I would advise students to select what conferences they go to wisely, because there is a certain limit of HDR funding. So, and of course nowadays they have to justify all expenditure. So be considered and pick your conferences and symposiums carefully. But yes, if you have the opportunity to go and the conference pertains to an area that is important to your research, then yes, I think it's a good idea.
Yes, also because in your field, usually I'd say during PhD study, you don't have like a very big network in the university. Not like the coursework students, because they are connected. They always communicate with each other during the classes. But for PhD study, you in general you don't go to any courses, and you work by yourself and your supervisors and some other professional colleagues maybe. But otherwise you don't really get to know many people in your field, and you don't have so many opportunities to get exposed to other ideas. Therefore, if there would be some kind of opportunities for a PhD student or candidate to network with people in his or her field, it would be much better to refine his or her ideas in the thesis, and also for the future career, it's also helpful. Okay, that's a question for me exactly, because I'm married and got my wife also here. It's kind of like very important. You really need to balance your life and work, because sometimes people, family members might feel like ignored if you just focus on your thesis or your work. For me, it's somehow better, as my wife is also doing research. We both share similar focus, therefore we can understand each other a bit better. But still, I think during the 3-4 years PhD journey, you have ups and downs, and sometimes you really feel frustrated if you don't have a family member to support you. Therefore, I would suggest that people, even you are very interested in your topic and you are very into your research, still take some time out of the research part and devote it to the family life. It's kind of like will also help you to adjust your research to the normal one, not just like pure closet PhD student.
I wish I knew. I think that you can't undertake a higher research degree unless you've got a reasonable chance of being able to do it. And if you're just a person operating as a single unit in this world, that's not so hard to do. You just figure out what your priorities are and you do that. And you have to remember that your supervisor is not your mother or your grandmother or your father. I mean, I don't feel a moral responsibility to make somebody work. If they don't want to work, that's their problem. But if you're in a family situation, it's impossible without support. And so if your decision is not the result of a consultative process, which will keep up, if your employer is not supportive, I mean, I've had lots of people, particularly, for example, policemen, who, when their colleagues find out what they're doing, will go out of their way either to make it easy by cooperating on rosters or to make it unbelievably hard by not cooperating on rosters. So you can't really control those things, but you can look at some of the problems in advance. And so what I think you need to do when you're thinking about doing this is to come and talk to someone who is an experienced supervisor just about this very issue, and then maybe go away and do some thinking and talking about it. The other problem comes up, of course, when your circumstances change. And that, again, is something that needs to be talked over with all of the stakeholders, and that certainly will include your supervisor. And, you know, I think we've probably experienced every human crisis that is in existence. And so, therefore, most of our rules are going to be flexible enough to deal with those. Sometimes there's a simple decision that now is not the time to do this. And so you wait, you go away. That's not failing. That's making a rational judgment about the things that really matter.
Yeah, yes, the work-life balance is fraught on occasions, I think, because the more invested you are in your research, the more you want to engage in it. So sometimes that poses a bit of a danger. Say that you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a spouse, or you have children or responsibilities to older parents, then yes, I think it is potentially difficult to manage, but I think it's doable. You just have to again set yourself achievable targets. You might want to achieve 1 or 2 things every day. Do that. If you can add to it, if you can do other things, then fine, fair enough. You've worked in advance. However, there comes a point where you really should go home and take time out to relax, to rejuvenate.
It's very, very important to maintain a balance with the PhD. One of the worst things what you can do is what's called binge writing. Ignoring and not doing your research right until the last minute before a chapter is due. It's very essential that you treat the PhD almost as a 9-to-5 job. That's how I treat it. It's a full-time job, and that's what you're there to do for 4 years. You certainly shouldn't have 1 day on, 1 day off. It's very important to maintain a 5-day working week, so that way you can reward yourself on the weekend, seeing friends and family and doing the things you like to do to give yourself and your body a break.
I think that's very difficult, particularly if the student is part-time, because I've studied part-time myself, and it is very, very difficult to combine that with family life, particularly when you've got young children. I think you have to have an understanding partner, and sometimes it leads to friction in relationships, and there is always an opportunity cost of doing anything.
That is a significant challenge for a PhD student, finding the right balance between working on the thesis and all the other things that the PhD students are going to have to do during that period that they're working on the thesis. I don't think there's any sort of magic formula here. It's going to be an ongoing, I don't want to say struggle, but it will be a challenge for that student for the entire time that they're enrolled in the thesis, because a thesis does have the tendency to expand and eat up more and more time, and more importantly to expand and eat up more and more sort of brain space. It's very easy for a PhD student to end up obsessing endlessly about their thesis and thinking about it constantly. So the PhD student needs to have the self-discipline and to have the people around them to constantly remind them that occasionally they need to take a break, to stop, put the thesis aside for a day or a week or a month sometimes, and focus on other things, recharge their batteries so that they can get back to work and be more productive.
Before they enter?
Yeah, before they enter.
Well, I think you've got to do due diligence on universities and supervisors, and choose the right place and the right supervisor if you have that luxury of choice. Sometimes you don't have that, either because you are confined to a particular geographical place, so you can only go to the local university, or your partner is in a job that ties you to a particular place. But these days universities are a bit more flexible. I knew a lady who was Australian. She was married to an oilman who was sent to Moscow, and she did a Cambridge PhD. So there was flexibility there by the Cambridge authorities, surprisingly. But as to preparing in advance, the secret is always to read widely and to be familiar with the subject. I mean, and to have a few ideas of your own, but then your ideas will often be rejected by potential supervisors who may not be interested in them. They may be interested in some peculiar idea of their own.
It's very important, first of all, that you research your topic. You need to find something that you're extremely interested in and that will keep you interested for 4 years, something that you feel deeply about and that will keep you motivated throughout the whole process. Next, it's very important to select your supervisor very carefully. You need someone who you're compatible with, someone who has strong research interests, and someone who's also experienced in supervising students, because it's an essential relationship for both you and your supervisor to give to your PhD. It's very important also to make sure that you have time for the PhD and a good work-life balance. You don't want to be doing a PhD whilst you're full-time working. It's very important that you have that work-life balance so that you can really focus on your PhD.
Firstly, I would just do enough reading. You don't need to focus on one point. You can choose a field that you are interested in, and then you just read randomly articles, whatever, and do a broad reading, not narrow one. And then if you have like kind of targeted at someone who is possibly to be a supervisor, contact him or her and read some his or her publications, his research works. That's also important for you at a later stage to communicate with them. And certainly you need to be well prepared for your commitment to this research. If you can't commit yourself for 3 or 4 years to a kind of like actually very dry work, because research is not exactly, especially law research, is not going to be very fun, and you have a lot of reading you find that not interesting, but you still need to do that. Therefore, be very well prepared for this kind of journey. PhD title is glorious, is very beautiful, but before that, you will have 3-4 years. Actually, I'd say pretty hard time.
A very good piece of advice that I was given when I started my PhD was to wait 6 months before I formally enrolled, and to spend that 6 months reading everything in the area, so that when I actually started the thesis formally and the clock started ticking, I was ready to start work straight away and not spending a lot of time wondering what I was going to write about. The analogy that I use a lot with people who are thinking about doing a thesis or about to start doing a thesis is to imagine a big room full of academics, and those academics have been there for hours and hours talking about the topic of your thesis, and they've been discussing it in little groups, and they've been discussing it collectively and looking at it from every single possible angle and arguing with each other about the particular area of research. And then you, the new student, you've walked into the room, you've arrived late, everybody's been talking for ages before you got there. What do? The temptation would be to say, "Hey everybody, guess what? I've got a great idea. What do you think?" And if you're lucky, everyone will turn to you and go, "Wow, that's fantastic. No one's thought of that before. Brilliant." But what's more likely to happen is everybody in the room is going to turn to you, roll their eyes and go, "Duh, we've been talking about that for hours. That's nothing new, and here's why that's not going to work." And you'll just embarrass yourself. So really what you should do when you walk into that room is not immediately yell out, "Hey everybody, this is what I think." It's just quietly walk around, listen in on the conversations, work out what everybody's talking about, work out what everybody's been saying for the last few hours. And then when you're across all the conversations, you might be able to say, "Actually, I think I've got something new here." It's more respectful, it's more humble, and you're more likely to be listened to. So that's how I think a new student should approach their thesis. Read first, get up to speed with every single conversation that's taking place around your topic, so that when you do actually speak up and say, this is what I think, you do so with credibility?
I suppose it depends on what level they're doing. I would have thought the best way to prepare, generally speaking, is to try to write as much as you can. Most undergraduate students probably won't have written more than a couple of thousand words, maybe 5,000 words if they're lucky. And I think it's quite a good idea to try to get a bit of practice in writing more stuff. At Bond, we've got student participation in the Bond University Law Review, and that's a good way of doing things. We have the moots, which call for some very high-level, intensive analytical writing. And those things are very good places to dip your feet in the water to find out whether or not you can do it. Because as well as it being an academic, creative, intellectual exercise, it's also almost a business exercise in learning how to do all the bits and pieces. One of the things you can also make sure is that you're totally up to date with the IT. The things that will help you, for example, develop your critical bibliographies, the things that will help you with your footnotes, the things that will help you with some of your egregious errors of style and grammar. And I think those are things that you can do, get under your belt and have those completely out of the way, so that you don't look at the supervisor and think, I don't know how to do that. And I think that at Bond particularly, there is a wonderful suite of programs to help. And also we have fabulous library people who go out of their way to help students. So I think Bond students are very fortunate in that respect.
Now you have heard from these professors and students. So what do you think? Are you going to apply to an HDR program? The pursuit of HDR study can be a challenging but also very rewarding experience. On one hand, it requires our commitment and discipline. On the other hand, it brings us joy, satisfaction, and a sense of achievement. What we decided to do in life and how we do it will define who we are. I hope you find this video informative and useful.